Hi there. Welcome to this lecture revising the content for the gender and crime topic for sociology A level. This is mainly orientated towards the AQA specification, but useful for all of them. I'm going to include sort of like the feminist view of crime in this lecture. I don't do a separate one on the feminist view of crime because it's very much kind of tied up in this particular topic. In terms of how I'm going to break this down and the key thinkers, I've put that in this slide. So the gender and crime debate generally kind of comes under these kind of headings, I think, when it comes to writing about. Firstly, the arguments and the debates about why do men commit crime, while some men might not. Then also why, I'll phrase that terribly, why do most women not commit crime and some do? But then we're also going to look at why we can't trust what the official statistics tell us, perhaps by the patterns of gender and criminality, but also gender and victimization. And yeah, the final bit I'm going to look at is what are the patterns of victimization when it comes to gender, and perhaps what are some of those explanations. Some of the key thinkers I'm going to talk about are Parsons' functionalist theory and explanations for why, Heinsohn and her control theory, Carlin, the class and gender deal, Adler, liberation thesis, Messerschmitt and his sort of normative masculinity, and Katz and edge work. I also mentioned Dick Hobbes's nighttime economy in this lecture as well. So, as I've said before, this is a good point to maybe pause and write down as much as you possibly know about what each of these theorists say, what each of those kind of subtopics, what you can remember about those kind of subtopics and their explanations for the patterns of gender, crime, and of course, victimization. And then you can use the rest of this lecture to check your knowledge. And now I'm just going to jump straight in. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is why do men commit crime while some don't? Now we spend a lot of time talking about the role of the media, and I've sort of described this as kind of sort of almost like a toxic socialization that can take place in the media. We looked at some of the quotes from lads mags from the past. Really, really kind of awful, both objectification of women and really kind of glorifying sexual violence against women as something that they would enjoy and something they want and they shouldn't say no to. And there is an argument that this kind of pervasive culture, which was in lads' mags in the past and perhaps now is more from a lot of the male influencers online, what that does, it kind of normalizes sexual crime and deviance. And most disturbingly, it kind of normalizes it within relationships as, oh, this is what's normal. This is what everyone else is doing. So that can kind of be used to explain why some men act criminally, but also can explain why women become victims of those types of crimes. Then we look at the ideas of Dick Hobbes. He wrote about the nighttime economy. He wrote also about maybe the moral panics around nighttime economies, about youth being blamed for drinking, for example. But that's not to do with gender and crime. And for this topic, gender and crime, Dick Hobbes argued that the nighttime economy explains why young men are more likely to commit crime because they're more likely to engage in the nighttime economy than women. There's much more opportunities for disorder-related offences to do with like drunkenness or being on drugs. Then that can lead to fights, violence, vandalism, believing that you can maybe, I don't know, jump over a car and perhaps landing on it and smashing in the window, like those types of things. And then James Messerschmitt, he talks about what he called normative masculinity, and I really like this concept. It's the idea that masculinity is something that has to be performed and worked at, just as with femininity has to be. And he pointed out that businessmen, predominantly middle class, can get masculinity, can be masculine through their role as managers over others in the workplace. And that can include like managing women and obviously other men, but that gives them status, that gives them kind of like their masculinity um, status, if you like, in the workplace. Whereas working class men aren't likely to be managers or bosses, and maybe might even have female managers of them. So as a result, they need to work at their masculinity in other ways. They need to perform their masculinity in other ways. And they can do this through things like crime and deviance, It can be things like drug taking. It can be through things like fighting, but it also includes things like domestic violence, which obviously would assert their control over women that then maybe not able to do in the workplace. Football hooliganism is quite a good example of where working class men are able to kind of perform in a really masculine way, where quite often alcohol, drugs, and fighting all mixed up together. And finally, we looked at the idea of postmodernist cats. He talks about edge work. So it's sort of a different explanation to why men engage in crime or deviance. And he said it's all to do with this kind of like thrill of risk-taking behavior. And edge work is like the edge of acceptable behavior. Like, so doing things on the edge of what's okay, the edge of what is normal. And that can be things like fighting or taking drugs. But he argued it's not because of trying to appear masculine, but it's genuinely because the men who do it, they actually really enjoy it on an individual level. So this is why it's a postmodern idea. It's the individual just really enjoying some criminal activity for the sake of the feeling that it gives them themselves. And he found that violence was especially thrilling for these groups. Now, it is worth mentioning that middle class men can much more easily pay for legitimate outlets for like edge work and risk taking, and they might pay for expensive adrenaline sports, whether that's like skydiving or even kind of type skiing, for example, surfing, whatever. Whereas the working class are not going to be able to do that, so they will perhaps seek other ways to get that kind of edge work thrill, according to postmodernist cats. So then the other element is, why do most women not commit crime? So I phrase that better here, while some do. Now, the main arguments for why they don't commit crime come from kind of Parsons and functionalism and Heinsohn's control theory. So, according to functionalist sex role theory, females, the roles that they're socialized into include things like being caring, passive, and being quite domestic, okay, being kind of happy at home. Whereas males are often socialized into, in their roles, stress things like being tough, aggressive, and maybe kind of like sexual conquest being a good thing. So according to functionalist Parsons, women just don't really want to commit crime. They don't have the right values to commit crime. They don't kind of want to be like that. However, there has been the growth of like ladette behavior, like girls behaving more like lads. I guess that comes from heavy, harder drinking, wanting, being more violent, acting more masculine. So that can explain that. Actually, some girls perhaps are now engaging in some of these kind of more aggressive and tough acts that can lead to crime and deviance. Heinsohn's control theory, now Heinsohn is a feminist. She actually says it's the fact that women kind of lack the opportunity to commit crime. Okay, so it's not necessarily that they don't want to; they just can't because they are so highly controlled by patriarchy in these three different contexts. So she says at home, women are controlled. So, for example, daughters quite often aren't let out as late. Daughters' time is controlled much more by parents. Parents are much more restrictive over daughters compared to sons. I know that certainly happened in my case compared to my brother. And also later in life, women are a lot more likely to be mothers. They're more likely to be responsible for children, and they're more likely to be responsible for the domestic sphere of the house. So they just don't have the chance to kind of go out and maybe commit crime or even plan a, I don't know, bank robbery. They haven't got the time or the brain capacity to kind of maybe do those things because of their domestic role. She also argued that women are less likely to commit a crime, perhaps maybe linked to the nighttime economy because of in the public sphere, so maybe out socializing, women are fearful of being shamed. They're fearful of like maybe getting really drunk and maybe then being shamed for being drunk. So women are less likely to maybe get themselves into kind of those sort of situations that Dick Hobbs said young men might, where they get drunk and disorderly and they perhaps get into fights or perhaps commit vandalism, because women are less likely to let themselves get that out of control. Or if they do, their friends will kind of quite quickly try and get them home. Okay, that's because they are controlled in public, women. And the final place that the women suffer control is patriarchal control, is the workplace. Women are controlled quite often by male bosses, and often they suffer kind of the issue of the glass ceiling, which means that they're not actually able to get to the opportunities high enough up to commit kind of white collar crime or corporate crime. That is much more of a masculine type of crime. However, Pat Carlin and Frida Adler, they argue that actually some women do commit crime. Now, Carlin, she talks about working class women, and she talks about the class and the gender deal. And she said, most of us are rewarded for our class deal. So if you work really hard, you will get rewarded with pay. However, she points out that working class women are often unemployed, they're on benefits, or they're on a really low income. So no matter how hard they work in their low income jobs, they still don't have very much money. And they might have loads of outlets because quite often they might be lone parents, for example. And many are rewarded by the gender deal. So women will be rewarded from their roles as a wife and a mother. You know, they'll be given financial stability by their male partner, perhaps. They'll be given lots of emotional support. But Carlin found that lots of working class women, and sorry, she did her research in a prison. So these are women who had been convicted of a crime. And she found that many of the women that she interviewed had suffered incredible neglect as children, but also as wives, as mothers. They were neglected by partners, they were abandoned. Many of them were abused physically, sexually, and were very, very, in that way, quite damaged. They hadn't benefited from an emotional reward. They'd often been abandoned to raise children by themselves, so they didn't have any financial support. And a number of them also had their children taken into care. So in that sense, they didn't even get a reward of being a mother. They didn't get that relationship. And she argued that as a result, many working class women commit crime because they are not getting these sort of rewards through these deals. So, for example, if your kids get taken into care, you might commit crimes associated with drug abuse and drug use because you might be like, well, I haven't got anything to lose, or you might be so distressed by the fact that that's happened. Okay. Whereas Frida Adler, perhaps we can use her liberation thesis to maybe explain kind of crime more broadly across women and other classes. Because she said that female crime is actually rising faster than men's because women's lives are becoming more similar to men's. So this might explain women becoming a bit more involved in organized crime, women taking part in some higher level crime where they're gaining access to some of the corporate responsibilities as they break through the glass ceiling. Which sounds like a really great theory, and her theory's from like the 1970s. However, more recent research tends to show that most female criminals are the working class who have been the least influenced by female liberation, and a lot of them are committing crimes much more associated with their gender role. That can be things like prostitution, drug muling, because they're being controlled by male drug dealers, if you like. So perhaps there hasn't been that much liberation for women when it comes to the criminal network, anyway. So yeah, why can we not really trust what the official statistics tell us about gender and crime? Well, firstly, we're going to start off with Pollack's chivalry theory. So Pollack argues that women are treated way more leniently by the criminal justice system at every single level. So the police are reluctant to arrest women; they let them off. The courts, including sort of the judges and the juries, they kind of filled with men who hate to accuse women. He argued that men do not like seeing women as criminal. They have this kind of chivalrous view of women kind of being, oh, that poor woman, she didn't mean to do it. She only did it once. So yeah, I'm sure she won't do it again. They don't like seeing women as criminal because that is not typical of the gender role. So Pollack would argue that official statistics on gender and crime really underestimate the level of female criminality. There's way more female crime going on out there, but we're just not seeing it because the police aren't arresting and the courts aren't sentencing them. A good example of that is the case of Lavinia Woodward. And if you're not aware of that case, please do Google it and have a look. Now, remember, she got a suspended sentence for stabbing her boyfriend in the leg in a drunken rage. Okay. And the judge, Lavinia Woodward, is a white middle class woman. I think she was studying at Oxford, possibly Cambridge, to do medicine. The judge said that, it would be a real waste of potential if her record was marred by a criminal record, for example, hence the suspended sentence. As long as she didn't do anything wrong, I think it was for 10 months, she would not kind of have that criminal record. And she never went to jail. Okay, so that is an example of the chivalry thesis. However, from an evaluative point of view, Pollock actually ignores how much male crime goes underreported. So, female victims of sexual and domestic violence, they often don't report, particularly if it's their current partner. And I'll talk about that a little bit more below. And there's also crimes of the powerful. Like, these are often males, or your corporate and your white collar crime, and they're also underreported and under investigated. So there are two areas of criminality where men are probably avoiding showing up in crime statistics. So I'm not saying that women aren't committing crime. I think probably there is an element to the chivalry thesis. However, men are also perhaps underreported in terms of the crimes that they're getting up to, both kind of like I said, sexual and domestic violence and crimes of the powerful. Now, Hindson really challenges Pollack's idea of the criminal justice system, and she really says, look, actually, women are punished way more harshly in the criminal justice system, and she said it's because of double deviance. This is because they've broken both the law and they've broken their gender role. Okay, so she feels that women are punished much more harshly; they're sentenced much more harshly if they break their gender and break the law. Sorry. An example of that, things like teenage girls, for example, are much more likely to be put into care for being sexually active when compared to teenage boys of the same age. Now, that's not necessarily a crime, but that could be argued that teenage girls are seen as more deviant. They suffer double deviance, whereas boys aren't taken into care if they're sexually active at the same age. We also looked at the example of Lucy Letby as well, the midwife who was convicted of being responsible for the deaths of, I can't remember how many babies it was in her care. And she, I think, is serving is serving at this current time 15 life sentences, which is, quite an extreme punishment. Many would argue completely justifiably, but that could also demonstrate double deviance because she's broken her role as a female carer. That's why it's been so shocking to everybody. Yeah, we can't trust the official statistics either because apparently arguably the criminal justice system treats female victims of crime really unfairly because of patriarchy. Now, there's a few things that go on that maybe mean we can't trust the data. Rape cases have an incredibly low conviction rate in the UK criminal justice system. So that means there's a number of victims coming forward and going through the investigation, the court case, and then it's getting to the end, and the case is either being thrown out from lack of evidence or the perpetrator is found not guilty. We also have a number, and it's not going away. We're getting a lot of cases where victims' underwear has been used as evidence that they wanted to have sex, like lacy underwear equals I wanted to have sex with whoever, and it couldn't have been rape. And victims have had their phone records, the phones are seized, and then their phones and their texts are kind of gone through to try and make the argument in many cases that they were consensual, that they wanted to have sex with this person, which seems to ignore the fact that at any point within an engagement between a couple, one person can at any point just say, you know what, I do not consent, I do not want to have sex anymore. But what's being done is that people are using message threads to say, look, she clearly was interested and she wanted to have sex with this person. What all this does is it kind of lowers the reporting of such crimes. Like, women look at these kind of cases, look at these statistics, look at these news stories, and if they are victims of sexual abuse or sexual violence, um, they don't want to report it because they're worried they won't be believed, they're worried that they'll be dragged through the dirt, and at the end of it there'll be no conviction. Okay, so that's another reason why we can't maybe trust official statistics on sexual violence and crimes where females are victims of abuse because they're maybe not reporting it. Finally, I just want to talk about the patterns of victimization. So, women are more likely to be victims of violent attacks by someone they know in their own home, whereas men, it's by strangers. The majority of crimes committed against women are carried out by men, and they include the use of violence. And many of these crimes against women are subject to significant underreporting. Okay, so it means they don't show up in the statistics. So feminists argue that violence against women is very much part of patriarchal control in society, and a lot of the time violence is used to reinforce male dominance. So, for example, there is a clear link between the crisis of masculinity that's kind of going on with deindustrialization and changes in the workplace, and perhaps feminization of the workplace, where we're getting a lot more women working, but also females managing men, with this sort of sense of powerlessness at work, a lot more divorce and unemployment, that loss of breadwinner status. So this sort of stuff's going on, and what we're seeing is an increase of violent crimes against women, where men are trying to reassert their masculinity through abuse of women. And then there's also the kind of sexual objectification of women, like women seen as property, women are seen as fair game, women are seen as belonging to men. And this is very much perpetuated by the media. We talked about it earlier on, those kind of lads mags and those male influencers, whereas like the idea that women belong to men, which means that they can be victimized by predominantly their partners. Okay, and that's why it's incredibly harmful, because that often happens in the privacy of the home, and is incredibly hard to investigate and report, for example. However, this is not quite evaluation. It's just kind of like a debate, I guess, where you say, "Oh yeah, females are like to be victims, but men overall are far more likely to be victims of crime." Okay, so overall, men are far more likely to be victims of crime. However, the types of crimes they're likely to be victim of are quite different. So women, much more likely to be victims of people of violence within their home, whereas men, it's likely to be victims of violent attacks by strangers in public spaces. And that is very much linked to that nighttime economy, that Dick Hobbs study that I talked about before. So they're more likely to have their wallets stolen. They're more likely to be punched. They're more likely to perhaps be a victim of road rage. All things to do with like perhaps a nighttime economy. Um, and of course, within relationships, within the domestic sphere, sorry, men are victims. Men are and can be victims of coercive control within relationships. They are victims of sexual violence, but these are significantly underreported. Okay, for reasons around masculinity, quite a lot of men are embarrassed to be in a controlling relationship with a partner. Quite a lot of men are embarrassed to be a victim of sexual violence because it doesn't fit in with their masculine identity. So they don't report it. So we can't trust the official statistics on these sort of patterns. It is worth mentioning that men being victims within relationships can occurs within both heterosexual and same-sex relationships. Like I personally do know people who have been involved in kind of these kind of quite destructive relationships, men and women. And what this does mean is that the official statistics are just not accurate. Okay, they are not telling us the entire picture. And I think a final point just to end on here is that what is often ignored when we look at the gender topic in sociology is the experience of the trans community. They suffer quite a lot of victimization in terms of like violence, verbal abuse, and hate crime, and this is often done by men or male groups linked to that idea of performative masculinity. Like, there's an argument that they are so hateful towards the trans community as a way of performing how masculine they are, if you like. So you might be able to link that back to Messerschmitt's ideas, but certainly perhaps linked maybe to that crisis of masculinity, the way they target trans people and the trans community. Um, so that is often a pattern that's kind of ignored. And there is a low level of reporting as well there, because the trans community don't often trust the police to investigate effectively. So that is another area where perhaps the levels of victimization is likely to be much higher. Okay, thanks so much for listening to this lecture. I hope you find it useful.